First, I'd like to talk about coaching and retention, which hopefully will prevent you from getting to corrective counseling. A great best practice to be proactive and provide opportunities for coaching is to have regular meetings with your direct reports or touch bases. Make sure you schedule these in advance and try to be as consistent as possible. It's also very important during these meetings to make sure that you share the air with the associate. The meeting should not only be about what you want to address, but also any issues they would like to discuss. It's also very important to be present during these meetings. Give the associate your full, uninterrupted attention. Don't pick up the phone or answer emails unless it's absolutely necessary. These meetings are a great opportunity to be proactive in managing accountabilities. Use them as opportunities to be clear about expectations. Give them an opportunity to ask questions about things they are unclear on. And this should prevent the need or result in less time spent doing corrective counseling. In addition to coaching, let's talk about a few other tips for retaining that valuable talent on your team. It's very important that you lead by example. People are watching what you do much more than they are listening to what you say, so be conscious of the image you're projecting in front of your associates at all times. Also, make sure to encourage feedback. Seek out their opinions. Oftentimes, the best ideas for improvements come from associates on the front line. It's important to maintain an open door policy so your team knows that you're willing to listen to their concerns and provide solutions to their problems when they need you. Be sure to communicate to your team often and clearly. Keep them fully informed of goals and priorities that might impact them. Share global updates about the company when you can, being mindful of confidentiality, of course. This will help them feel part of the bigger picture, help them understand how their role fits into the goals of the company. This helps build loyalty to the company and commitment to their role. It's very important to give recognition to your associates, recognizing their efforts and achievements. Do this individually and publicly when possible. Recognition doesn't always have to be formal, but it definitely helps build confidence and encourages future contributions and effort. It's also important to create an environment that encourages learning and development. Encourage them to innovate and challenge the status quo. Make sure you have an environment where it is safe to take a risk and potentially make a mistake, as long as we learn from the mistakes and don't repeat them, of course. And finally, don't be afraid to talk to your associates about career development. If you're not interested in investing in their careers, I promise you there's somebody else that is. Be consistent with your associates. Make sure you are treating similar requests and circumstances the same. Avoid any behavior that might give the perception that you play favorites. Make sure to always be professional in front of your associates and control your emotions. As the manager, it's important that you always take the high road and be the bigger person. Avoid oversharing your personal issues. Don't vent to your associates about their peers or about your personal struggles or any other issue that might negatively impact their morale. Sometimes, no matter how much coaching we've done, we will find that some associates will need corrective counseling. So it's important to prepare adequately before taking that step. Before you begin counseling, it's important to do your research. Review the employee's record. Consider facts only, not opinions, and read through their past performance reviews. Two of the main keys to successful corrective counseling are documentation and consistency. Do an investigation into the facts and circumstances that you're counseling the associate about and take very good notes. Get witness statements if that's relevant. Be consistent. Again, make sure you're handling similar issues the same and be mindful of perceptions from protected classes. Let's take a closer look at what we mean by the term protected classes. When delivering corrective counseling, we don't want the associate being counseled to feel that the facts we are addressing have anything to do with anything that would be inappropriate. A list of protected classes, areas of the law that would be inappropriate to consider in any kind of termination or corrective counseling situation would be the associate's age, their gender, their race or ethnicity, their religion, disability, veteran status, or that the action is some sort of retaliation for them filing a workers' comp claim, a Family Medical Leave Act claim, an Americans with Disabilities claim, harassment, safety violation, or any of the legal areas where retaliation is a concern. The counseling process is designed to be progressive. Remember, the goal is to provide associates with feedback and notice of their development needs so they have an opportunity to improve their performance and be successful. So the timing is essential. You want to be fair. An associate who isn't aware of what they're doing wrong has no opportunity to do better. Now, depending on the severity of the situation, sometimes steps of progressive discipline can be skipped, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So when should counseling start? Don't procrastinate. Start counseling sooner rather than later. Remember, your associates can only benefit from this constructive feedback. Now, it's typically a best practice to go in progression. So starting with a verbal warning at the first sign of poor performance that your coaching didn't resolve. Now, counseling for a policy violation should happen immediately following the events that are relevant. If too much of a time gap exists between the events and the counseling, it casts a shadow over your true motivation. Next, let's review all the steps in the counseling process. But first, be sure you're consulting with human resources if that's relevant in your organization, or legal counsel when appropriate, especially before delivering a termination notice. The typical progressive steps in corrective counseling start with the verbal warning, which represents the initial documentation to try to improve an issue that proactive coaching wasn't able to resolve. The next step would be a written warning, which is the follow-up to the verbal if the behavior continues or the performance issue continues. Then you may go to a final written to make sure the associate knows that if their performance or the behavior does not improve, termination will result. And then finally, a termination notice. This documentation is very important. Be sure that the final circumstances are articulated well. Another best practice to help accomplish the documentation, which is critical in the corrective counseling process, is to have a disciplinary notice form. I've included a sample here. As you can see at the top, it just has the critical information, the employee's name and their job title, and then a place to indicate what kind of disciplinary notice we are delivering. You may also want to include details of the violation. What kind of issue is it? Is it a policy issue, an attendance issue, and so on. Two other critical pieces is to make sure you explain the events that led to the corrective counseling issue. And then also list any prior warnings or disciplinary action that is related to this issue. So especially if it's a written warning or a final written warning, you want to make sure that you show that you went through progression. It's also sometimes helpful to have a summary of the corrective action being taken and any consequences of failure to improve. So will there be a follow-up performance discussion? And if there's no improvement, will the next step of discipline result, or will termination be the next step? Then it's very important. The most important part of the form is the signature and the date at the bottom. Oftentimes, employees will refuse to sign a disciplinary notice, which is why I always recommend having a witness in the meeting with the manager to sign that this document was presented to this associate in my presence. You may consider, though, including an employee statement and acknowledgement in there where they can sign off saying, yes, this was delivered to me, but I don't agree with it, and there's an opportunity for them to provide comments. Sometimes that'll get you over the hurdle of, I don't want to sign this form. But if you have a witness sign that it was presented to them, that really is sufficient. Another tool in the counseling process, which can sometimes be helpful, is a performance improvement plan. You would use this type of a document when you need to identify specific issues that an associate needs to improve their performance. It serves as almost a roadmap of the things they need to do to be successful. This type of plan may exist with or without corrective counseling. It can actually serve as a verbal warning if no other foundation for corrective counseling has been created. It's not for every issue, though. Really just performance issues, maybe attitude, are appropriate for a performance improvement plan. But it wouldn't be appropriate for something like tardiness, because really they just need to not be tardy. There's not much else to say. I mentioned earlier that sometimes you may not want to be progressive with your discipline. So when is it appropriate to skip steps in the counseling process? First, it's important to understand your policy. Do you have an employee handbook? Is there a policy where the company reserves the right to bypass steps in the progressive discipline process? That is, of course, recommended. Examples of serious issues that you might include in such a policy that warrant skipping steps are things like overt sexual harassment, stealing, falsifying your time card, threats of violence, insubordination, or walking off the job, to name a few. I always like to include in my policies a footnote at the bottom that says this list is not exhaustive, so you don't remove any flexibility you might want for an issue of first impression. The last section of our training is going to go through some best practices for when you actually sit down for the counseling discussion. Now, before you schedule your counseling discussion, be sure you've prepared adequately. You've done all your research, you've investigated the facts and documented them thoroughly. It's a good idea to include the key points that you want to cover in the actual counseling discussion. It's a very stressful time delivering a corrective counseling, and so having that in front of you will keep you from losing your train of thought. Make sure you jot down any goals or objectives that you want to review if that's relevant. Also conduct the meeting in a private setting, an office or a conference room, preferably where there isn't an open window where everybody can see. Face-to-face, of course, is optimal versus over the phone. And as I mentioned earlier, always include an appropriate witness. Be prepared to discuss the issue specifically. Identify the problematic behavior or performance concern and provide examples. Make sure you give clear, specific details and relay fact-based information, not opinions. Be sure to articulate the expectations going forward clearly and document this discussion. The expectations should be realistic and attainable and should not be in conflict with any already established goals. Finally, let's talk about the reaction that you might receive from the associate that you're counseling and how you might want to handle it. Sometimes associates will be angry, may even try to intimidate you. It's okay to let the associate vent, a little, not for too long. It's a good idea to paraphrase their feelings back to them while emphasizing the facts and the seriousness of the matter, but that you understand how they feel. Other reactions might be tears or emotional despair. It's okay to be human in these situations. Be empathetic with them, but don't waver from the point of discussion. Another reaction may be complaining or blaming another. Again, it's okay to let them say their piece, but make sure you bring the focus back onto the associate and their behavior that led to the counseling, and stress that the purpose of the meeting is to help them. Finally, one reaction may just be complete silence. Be sure that you ask a few open-ended questions to make sure that they understand what was presented to them and that the points of the conversations are still valid even if they didn't respond.